Welcome to Crimes in the Dark, the channel where the most chilling crimes come to life in the dark. Before sleep catches up with you, subscribe and tell me where you're listening to this story from. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let yourself go, because what you are about to hear is real. Case 1. On October 14th, on a quiet residential street in Portland, Oregon, the silence of the night was broken by a piercing scream. Alarmed neighbors called the police after hearing strange noises coming from the Miller home. When officers broke into the home, what they found chilled even the most experienced investigators. In the living room, the lifeless body of Dr. Richard Benson, the family's family physician, lay in a pool of blood. His skull was shattered from a brutal blow with a baseball bat. But what really horrified everyone occurred in the master bedroom. There, on a bed covered in crimson-tinged white sheets, lay the limp body of Emily Miller. The cause of her death was even more macabre. Someone had carefully severed the femoral vein in her hip, leaving her to bleed out slowly. The scene was designed to mimic the methods of a notorious serial killer known as the Tailor, who used to operate years ago but had been missing for some time. Was it a coincidence? Emily Miller came from a wealthy family whose fortunes had been built up over generations. Her grandfather, Charles Whitmore, had built a real estate empire that over the years had expanded into other sectors. At 38, Emily lived a comfortable life with her husband, Jonathan Miller, a man in his early 30s. The couple lived in an elegant colonial-style home in Hollow Creek, Portland. Although Emily kept a low profile, she participated in charity events and enjoyed an impeccable reputation in social circles. Dr. Richard Benson, 45, was a well-known physician who worked for Medcare Elite, a private agency that provided exclusive medical care to high-profile families. His job was to cover any of the Millers' medical emergencies and perform routine checkups. That night, he was at the Miller home for a consultation, leading investigators to believe that his murder may have been a tragic coincidence, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, the crime scene raised disturbing questions. The manner in which Emily was murdered replicated the method of the Tailor. The case looked like an exact copy of his crimes, which generated a chill among the investigators. But there was something that didn't fit. The detectives, familiar with the killer's modus operandi, noticed the absence of one crucial detail. The Tailor always took a lock of hair from each victim as a trophy, a hallmark he had never omitted. But this time, Emily's hair was intact. There was no sign that the killer had cut even a single strand of her brown mane. The absence of this ritual completely changed the direction of the investigation. Was it possible that El Sastre had returned and altered his pattern after years of silence? Or had someone imitated his method to divert attention from the true motive of the crime? Detective Marcus Holloway, a veteran with more than 25 years of homicide experience, was leading the investigation. The crime scene was overly meticulous, with no signs of a break-in or struggle. What puzzled Holloway most, however, was the absence of the Tailor's signature. The killer always cut a lock of hair from his victims, a detail he had never omitted. That single difference ruled out any possibility that the infamous criminal had returned. For an instant, Holloway felt the frustration of having missed an opportunity to solve a landmark case, but he forced himself to focus. Experience had taught him that in most homicides, the prime suspect was usually the spouse or romantic partner. Jonathan Caldwell would be no exception. The Portland airport was crowded. Amid the bustle of travelers and the echo of announcements, Holloway moved steadily forward, watching every face he passed. It didn't take him long to identify Jonathan Caldwell. The young man was walking alongside his older brother, Ethan. The difference in their mannerisms was evident. Ethan held his head high and his eyes alert, while Jonathan strode forward with slumped shoulders and a pale face, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. The baseball cap barely covered his eyebrows, and the wrinkled clothes showed the rush of the trip. Holloway approached them without hesitation. Stepping in front of Jonathan, he pulled out his badge with a firm motion. The young man's gaze met the detective's, reflecting first surprise and then discomfort. The tension was evident in the way he clenched his jaw and clenched his fists at his sides. The detective introduced himself tersely and asked him when he had last seen his wife alive. Jonathan blinked, as if the question had taken him by surprise. His breathing became more rapid, and the skin on his face took on a paler hue. For a few seconds, he seemed to be torn between answering or holding back the indignation that flashed in his eyes. The suspicion implicit in the question hit him hard, and his body reacted with a barely perceptible tremor. Jonathan shook his head and muttered a few quick, angry words. His curt gestures and the way he looked away revealed his frustration. The thought of being considered a suspect seemed to outrage him more than expected. However, Holloway maintained his composure. With a slight shake of his head, he indicated that the question only sought to rule him out as a suspect. Jonathan took a deep breath, and after a few seconds, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The sound of the paper unfolding broke the tension of the moment. The receipt, slightly crumpled, bore the letterhead of a hotel in Seattle. The check-in date and time matched the night of the murder. Jonathan held out the document with a stiff, tense gesture, as if he found the very action humiliating. Holloway took the paper and examined it without taking his eyes off the young man. The evidence was clear and direct. Despite having proved his alibi, the pain was still imprinted on Jonathan's face. Finally, after a tension-filled pause, Jonathan took a deep breath and looked up with difficulty. His expression reflected a mixture of weariness, pain, and something more difficult to define, a kind of bitter resignation. The marital crisis with Emily was no secret. The weeks leading up to the murder had been marked by arguments and estrangement. She had mentioned divorce, though Jonathan never believed things would go that far. Infidelity seemed to have been the trigger, and although he tried to justify his actions, the guilt was reflected in every gesture. Before leaving, Jonathan added a detail that caught Holloway's attention. Emily had always been cared for by the owner of Medcare Elite, a physician whose professional relationship with the family stretched back years. However, the man murdered in the house was not that physician, but Dr. Richard Benson, someone Jonathan barely knew by name. Benson's presence in the house the night of the murder was odd. The implication floated in the air without needing to be uttered. Jonathan and his brother walked away through the crowd, losing themselves among the travelers who continued on their way, oblivious to what had just happened. Holloway watched them until they disappeared from sight. The husband's alibi seemed solid, but something in his attitude left an unsettling feeling. The mention of Benson opened up a new line of investigation that Holloway could not ignore. Wasting no time, he set out to follow the trail. The Medcare Elite building was located in the heart of Portland. Detective Marcus Holloway moved through the lobby with his partner, moving through the space without stopping until they reached the reception desk. After identifying themselves, they were ushered directly into the office of the medical director, Dr. Samuel Hawthorne. The door closed with a soft click behind them. Hawthorne, an elderly man, waited for them behind a plain-lined desk. His graying hair and serene expression contrasted with the calculating attention in his gaze. Despite the initial cordiality, there was something in his posture that seemed to gauge the visitor's every move. Bluntly, Holloway asked about his role as the Caldwell family physician. The question seemed to tense Hawthorne's features slightly. For an instant, his fingers twitched on the table before calmly intertwining. He replied that, while he remained the primary physician for most practices, Medcare Elite offered a wide range of services, from emergencies to cosmetic procedures. However, the professional relationship with Emily had drifted apart when she asked him for over-the-counter birth control pills. Refusing to provide them without the proper procedures, Emily sought out her colleague, Dr. Richard Benson, who agreed to help her. The decision did not bother him, as they were both in the same company, and the patient was still in the care network. However, Hawthorne added a detail that caught Holloway's attention. Emily's request was curious, considering that he himself had performed Jonathan Caldwell's vasectomy sometime before. His comment hung in the air, permeating the room with a subtle tension. When detectives hinted at the possibility of a romantic relationship between Emily and Benson, Hawthorne denied any implication in that direction. In a neutral tone, he explained that Benson was homosexual, a known fact within the professional circle. His response seemed to close that line of suspicion, but the conversation did not end there. After a brief pause, Hawthorne mentioned something else. During the medical checks performed on the Caldwells, he had noticed a particular closeness between Emily and Ethan, Jonathan's older brother. He didn't state anything directly, but the hint floated in the air like another piece of the puzzle. Before taking his leave, Hawthorne expressed his bewilderment at the direction of the investigation. He mentioned that, according to press reports, everything pointed to a serial killer, which made the detective's presence unexpected. However, when Holloway named the tailor, the doctor seemed to hesitate for a brief moment. He denied ever having heard of the criminal, but the slight delay in his response did not go unnoticed. Back in the lobby, the echo of his footsteps echoed in the air as Holloway mentally reviewed the information he had obtained. A vasectomy that made birth control pills unnecessary, a homosexual doctor ruled out as a lover, and a possible inappropriate relationship between brothers-in-law. And in the midst of it all, Hawthorne's ambiguous reaction to hearing the name The Tailor, a shadow from the past that seemed to skim the surface of that double murder. The cool light of the interrogation room highlighted Ethan Caldwell's every gesture. Sitting across from the detectives, his hands trembled slightly as he tried to contain his labored breathing. Eyes, sunken and reddened, reflected a mixture of guilt and fear. Bluntly, he admitted that he had been in a relationship with Emily for months. What began as a familial closeness turned into something more when she confessed that her marriage to Jonathan had deteriorated. Her brother's sports frustrations were making him distant and temperamental, and Emily had found in Ethan an emotional refuge. Guilt weighed on every word. He had thought about confessing everything to Jonathan, but the fear of destroying him had held him back. Now fear consumed him. He believed his brother had discovered the relationship and, in a fit of rage, had killed Emily. Since the day of the crime, the thought had haunted him relentlessly, and the possibility that his betrayal had caused the tragedy haunted him. When he finished, Ethan sank back in his chair, exhausted, his eyes glued to the table. The confession had added a new piece to the case, a forbidden relationship, a frustrated husband, and the suspicion of a crime of passion. But the question still hung in the air. Had Jonathan been the culprit? And if not, who had ended Emily and Dr. Benson's lives? The air in the interrogation room felt thick, as if every second increased pressure on the walls. Facing the detectives, Dr. Samuel Hawthorne held a tense expression, his hands clasped on the table in a rigid gesture that seemed to contain something deeper. The white light fell on his face, highlighting the lines marked by the years, but in his eyes there was no weariness, only something darker. It all started with a call. Medcare elite security staff had reviewed the cameras after noticing unusual activity in Dr. Benson's office. The footage showed Hawthorne entering his colleague's room after hours, going through drawers and eventually taking Benson's personal laptop. There were no signs of violence or sufficient evidence to consider it a crime, but the fact that the clinic director was acting in such a clandestine manner raised questions. What puzzled investigators most, however, was his reaction during Holloway's first visit. It was Hawthorne who, in the middle of the conversation, asked if the crime might not have been the work of a serial killer. The seemingly casual question caught the detective's attention. Holloway, noting his expression, replied with a direct question. "Do you mean the tailor?" There was a brief moment of silence. Hawthorne's reply came with a barely perceptible delay. He denied knowing that name, but in his eyes there was a fleeting glint, as if the question had touched something he preferred to keep hidden. Now, sitting in the unrelenting light of the interrogation room, Hawthorne could no longer escape the truth. His breathing slowed, as if each word took calculated effort. For years he had used Medcare Elite to divert funds to finance donations to a foundation that supported more than 3,000 homeless children. The inflated bills went unnoticed among the luxury treatments and cosmetic surgeries of his wealthier clients. The Miller family, with their medical history and ability to pay, had been one of his main targets. No one suspected anything, until Dr. Richard Benson uncovered the irregularities. Benson had confronted him days before the murder. His intention was to inform Emily Miller, knowing that she, with her fortune and character, could not only stop the fraud, but also sink Hawthorne's reputation and destroy everything he had built. The risk was too high. He could not allow Benson to talk. On the night of the crime, everything was planned. Benson had gone to Emily's house for a medical consultation, and Hawthorne followed him. He waited outside, hidden in the gloom, until Emily opened the door. The sound of the hinges turning the handle was his signal. He moved quickly. Before they could react, the electric taser whistled through the darkness and struck the doctor in the back. Benson immediately collapsed, falling on top of Emily and dragging her to the ground with the weight of his body. The impact left her dazed, with no time to comprehend what was happening. Hawthorne took advantage of the confusion and applied a second shock to her side, immobilizing her instantly. The room fell silent, broken only by the residual hum of the taser. Hawthorne's agitated breathing echoed in the gloom as he watched the motionless bodies. Time was pressing. With swift movements, he dragged Benson to the center of the room, leaving a barely perceptible trail on the wooden floor. The baseball bat rested by the entrance, just as he had seen it on his previous visit. He raised it with both hands, and without hesitation, unloaded an accurate blow on the doctor's skull. The dry crunch of bone fracturing mingled with the dull impact of the body against the floor. Blood began to spread in a dark pool, permeating the air with its metallic smell. Then he turned back to Emily, who was still unconscious. He lifted her with difficulty, carrying her in his arms as he climbed the stairs, the effort reflected in his gasping breaths. Reaching the bedroom, he laid her carefully on the bed. The pale glow of the night lamp illuminated the white sheets, soon to be tinged crimson. Fearing she would awaken, he applied another taser blast directly to her torso. The spasm ran through his body for an instant before he went limp again. With a sharp blade, he cut the femoral vein in his left hip, ensuring that the blood quickly seeped into the white sheets. Each move replicated the method of the tailor, a deliberate attempt to divert attention to the serial killer whose shadow still haunted the collective memory. The plan was clear. If investigators believed the tailor had returned, they would focus on Emily as the primary victim and not Benson. The real motive for the murder would be buried under the legend of the serial killer. However, in the midst of the rush and tension, he made a mistake. He forgot to cut the lock of hair, the hallmark of El Sastre. That omission, the result of nervousness, was what began to crumble his alibi. After the scene was over, Hawthorne quickly retreated, convinced that he had succeeded in diverting attention. For the first few days after the murder, he thought everything was solved. Newspaper headlines spoke of the possible return of the tailor, and the police seemed to be following that lead. But the calm was shattered by Detective Holloway's visit to Medcare Elite. Concern turned to panic when he realized that investigators could search Benson's office and find the incriminating emails. The doctor's laptop contained evidence of the embezzlements, altered invoices, irregular transfers, and messages evidencing his intentions to denounce him. If the police ever saw it, his fate would be sealed. Driven by fear, Hawthorne returned to the clinic. He waited until the end of the day when most of the staff had left and headed straight for Benson's office. He knew the cameras might have caught him, but he no longer cared. The need to protect his secret was stronger than any precaution. Now, sitting in front of detectives, his final words were a mixture of justification and despair. He claimed that his embezzlement had funded medical treatment, education, and shelters for thousands of homeless children. He said he had saved more lives than he had taken. But his voice cracked at the end, aware that no argument could erase what he had done. The silence that followed the confession seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Hawthorne looked down, aware that his life had reached a point of no return. The door to the room opened with a metallic sound, and the footsteps of the officer approaching to escort him echoed like the echo of an inescapable sentence. Days later, neither Hawthorne's advanced age nor his charitable works were enough to move the jury. The trial, which captured national media attention, culminated in a unanimous verdict. guilty of first-degree murder with premeditation and malice aforethought for the deaths of Emily Miller and Dr. Richard Benson. The evidence of the laptop theft, the simulation of the Taylor's modus operandi, and the brutality of the murders outweighed any attempt at justification. The judge, in passing sentence, called Hawthorne's actions coldly calculated and morally reprehensible. The courtroom was completely silent when the sentence was announced. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The metallic sound of handcuffs closing on his wrists marked the end of a case that left indelible scars on the city of Portland. Case 2. Cooperville, a small, quiet town in northern Illinois, had never known violence. But on that gray October morning, everything changed. The body of 22-year-old Emma Langford was found in a deserted field a few miles from town. The cause of her death was clear: asphyxiation. There was no sign of a struggle. Her body was intact, but her expressionless face seemed to accept the inevitable. Detective William Rowe arrived on the scene. It was not a normal scene. There were no witnesses, no marks of struggle, not a trace of desperation. Everything seemed orderly. The field was precisely chosen. Silence was the only thing that could say anything. Something didn't fit, and Rowe knew it. This was no ordinary crime. The autopsy confirmed what he already suspected. Emma had died of asphyxiation, with no signs of abuse. The case didn't offer many clues, but Rowe wasn't about to give up. Something about Emma's death didn't add up, and he was going to find out what. After the autopsy, Rowe went directly to the Langford home. There, Emma's parents were devastated. The mother, her eyes swollen with tears, asked shakily, "Was she raped?" The question came out in pain, but also with the hope of not seeing the worst come true. Rowe shook her head, confirming what she already knew. There were no signs of abuse. However, the parents could not help but wonder how something so terrible had happened to their daughter. Emma was a young woman known for her dedication to the vow of chastity, a girl who kept her distance from the world. Neighbors described her as quiet, calm, closed off. Her religious devotion to her purity was more than an act of faith. It was her way of life. The Langford house was simple, no frills, a reflection of ordinary country life. Rowe began to walk through it, looking for any clues. Emma's room was tidy, almost too tidy. On the bedside table, he found a framed photo, Emma smiling next to a woman, but the corner of the photo was torn. Someone had wanted to erase that part of the story. Rowe studied the picture. Something about it wasn't right. The unknown woman, the torn photo. Everything pointed to Emma having had something her parents didn't know about. Emma's father, seeing Rowe's interest in the photo, tensed. "It was her friend from school," he said in a hesitant voice. Rowe said nothing but kept the information to himself. That woman, that broken friendship, had to be important. Then the father blurted out a sentence Rowe wasn't expecting. He never came home from work that day. He went out as usual in the morning. He never came back. That changed everything. Something happened that day. Emma never returned home after her day at the restaurant. That detail was not minor. Rowe was silent as he analyzed what that meant. Something happened between Emma's departure and her death, and it wouldn't be easy to figure out. Rowe's next step took him to La Parada del Camino restaurant, a large roadside establishment frequented by travelers stopping to rest. The place was known for its strategic location, but with a rotating clientele that left no room for anyone to stand out too much. The owners, a middle-aged couple, greeted him with obvious nervousness. The man, stocky and somewhat disheveled, spoke first. He said that the last time he saw Emma was after his shift, late at night. She left the restaurant alone and got into an old red van parked outside. Although he did not see the driver, he said the van drove off in a southerly direction, leaving the town behind. What caught Rowe's attention was not so much the story itself, but how the owner emphasized Emma's beauty several times, albeit in a somewhat offhand manner. He mentioned not only her looks, but also her purity, as if he were marking a difference between her and other young women in the village. He spoke of Emma's vow of chastity, of her spotless morality, but without going so far as to exaggerate. The way he said it, while not obsessive, was unnecessary, as if he were trying to emphasize something more than just the facts. Most suspicious was his demeanor. The man seemed nervous, avoiding looking at Roe directly, and his answers were quick, but always sought to give a more polished picture of what had actually happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that the owner was trying to divert the conversation to side issues, such as Emma's personality, rather than focusing on the specific details Roe needed to know: the van, the exact time, and any other relevant facts. Although the owner's wife didn't seem that upset, their concern didn't seem to be about Emma's disappearance, but about something else, something that Roe still couldn't quite put his finger on. There was a slight sense of discomfort in the air, as if they were holding something important back. Roe was silent as he took note of everything he observed: the red van, Emma's lonely exit, the owner's emphasis on her purity. Something didn't add up, but it wasn't yet clear what. After speaking with the restaurant owners, Roe gathered the staff in a secluded room. Two people stood out among the employees: a young woman about 25 years old, who appeared to be the same one he had recognized in the photo at Emma's house. The other was a man in his mid-30s, who, despite his presence, did not attract as much attention as the woman. Roe began with the woman, who, upon seeing him enter, maintained a distant, almost indifferent attitude. She introduced herself as Rachel Garza, and quickly made it clear that her relationship with Emma had been strictly professional. "We were not friends," she said flatly. "Just co-workers. We didn't have much in common." But something about the way he said it didn't sound completely sincere. Roe watched his movements, his tone of voice, and noticed there was a slight awkwardness when he mentioned Emma, as if she was avoiding saying more than she really meant to. The woman was trying to downplay any link to the victim, but her attitude seemed too calculated. The detective continued to probe, and as soon as he touched on the subject of Emma's morality, Rachel reacted with a slight tension. She said that Emma was very strict with her principles, and that this made her different from the rest of the girls in town. When Roe mentioned Emma's famous vow of chastity, Rachel was even more reserved. She spoke of it as something foreign to her way of life, as if she were trying to minimize it, but her words were laced with something that Roe perceived as slight resentment. It seemed to bother Rachel somehow that Emma had stayed so far away from the more liberal attitudes of the others. Roe watched Rachel for a few more seconds. The woman didn't seem to want to talk about Emma anymore, and everything she had said so far suggested an emotional distance that might hide something else. Why so much insistence on avoiding details? Why so much care in mentioning Emma? Roe thought as he made a mental note of every little sign. Roe continued his investigation. The next person questioned was a visibly nervous young man with a sweaty face and tense gestures. When the detective stared at him, he began to speak. He said that, after his shift, he followed Emma to the parking lot. He was intrigued by her vow of chastity, her purity. He thought maybe he could approach her, that he was a good guy and had a chance. But Emma reacted immediately. She hit him and ran into a parked red van. He insisted that he just wanted to talk, that he had no bad intentions, but Emma's reaction left him puzzled. The van started southbound, and not knowing what else to do, he returned to the restaurant. Roe listened to him carefully. Something in his story did not fit. The boy wasn't entirely lying, but he wasn't telling the whole truth either. Finally, the young man blurted out a detail he had been avoiding. He recognized the van. It belonged to Rachel's ex-boyfriend, who used to visit her from time to time. Roe raised an eyebrow. The boy had left that out on purpose, as if trying to protect someone. He tried to justify himself. He had seen the van before. He never thought Emma was in danger. But the detective wasn't fooled. What did Rachel's ex have to do with it? What else was the young man hiding? Every word added to Rachel's suspicions. Her ex-boyfriend, the van, Emma's reaction. The case was taking a darker turn than Roe had anticipated. Roe wasted no time in questioning Rachel again. This time he confronted her with the new information. At first, she tried to dodge the issue, but the detective gave her no room to evade the truth. The pressure was mounting and something about her story just didn't add up. Finally, Rachel sighed, resigned. She had lied about the van and her supposed ex-boyfriend. In reality, the owner of the vehicle was someone much closer, Emma's cousin. She hadn't mentioned him before because she was afraid she'd be linked to something illegal. Her fear was not unfounded. Emma's cousin wasn't just trouble. He was a known gang member in town. Rachel never wanted to get involved with him, but Emma introduced him some time ago. What bothered her most was his obsession with her cousin. To Rachel, it was sickening. She didn't understand how Emma ignored the danger signs she saw so clearly. When Emma confessed to her that she was going away to college, Rachel felt that everything would get worse. Her cousin would lose Emma, and Rachel feared how she would react. He didn't just see her as a cousin. She was something more, something she was never meant to be. Rachel had kept her distance, trying to protect her, but now with Emma missing, guilt gnawed at her. Had she done enough? Roe took note of every detail. Everything fit. But the question remained the same. What happened that night? Was Emma's cousin responsible? Rachel spoke with tension in her voice, her eyes heavy with guilt. If Emma was trying to escape, her disappearance was not just an isolated event. It was the result of years of fears, resentments, and hidden secrets. And with every word, the case became even darker. Carlos Rivera was arrested and taken to the police station. His face reflected devastation and guilt. Sitting across from Detective Roe, he avoided eye contact, caught in a storm of consuming thoughts. In a trembling voice, he confessed what he had hidden for so long. Not only had he had a secret relationship with Emma, but it was forbidden, incestuous. He knew it was wrong, that it should never have happened, but he couldn't stop it. Everything changed when Emma told him she was going away to college. The thought of losing her filled him with rage. He couldn't stand her running away, looking for a future far from him. That night, he left her a few blocks from his house without saying a word. He didn't try to stop her, but he couldn't accept that she was really leaving either. Hours later, guilt hit him hard. His fury had blinded him, and when he wanted to look for her to apologize, Emma had already disappeared. Frustration turned to unbearable remorse. For the first time, he understood that she was right. He would never give her the life she deserved. He was a gangbanger, not just a troubled youth, but someone with a history of violence, trafficking, and dangerous connections. In Cooperville, his name was whispered with suspicion. Many knew him, but no one spoke of him openly. With growing unease, Carlos mentioned a detail Roe hadn't expected. Emma had told him that her boss was harassing her. It wasn't just innuendo, but a constant abuse of power. When she confronted him, his wife tried to silence her by offering her money. But when Emma refused, he went further. He suggested that she sleep with her husband for more money. Emma refused everything. She didn't want money, she didn't want manipulation. She just wanted to escape. She kept working in that restaurant with a single purpose: to gather what she needed to run away. But now, Emma was dead. And with each new revelation, her death grew even darker. Carlos Rivera had already been questioned and arrested, but the focus of the investigation now fell on Hector Salazar, owner of La Parada del Camino restaurant, and his wife, Lorena Salazar. Roe had been analyzing the businessman's bank accounts and discovered financial movements that had no simple explanation. At first glance, they looked like payments to former employees. But as he dug deeper into the records, the truth came to light. They were not salaries or compensation. They were transactions intended to silence voices. The pattern was clear. Several women who had worked at the restaurant received sums of money after leaving their jobs. None officially denounced Salazar, but some had disappeared without a trace, and others simply left town without ever speaking of it again. Something in these figures spoke louder than any testimony. When Roe confronted Hector with the evidence, he tried to cling to his facade. He denied any involvement in illicit activities, but the tension in his face gave him away. The detective pressed further, exposing the suspicious payments, the accusations that, though never official, had circulated among some of the women who passed through La Parada del Camino. Salazar began to crumble. His initial confidence turned to evasions. Finally, it became clear. The restaurant was not just a business, it was a trap. For years, Hector Salazar had used his establishment to subdue young women. He gained their trust with promises of stable employment and a safe work environment, but once inside, he turned them into his victims. What began with overt overtures and condescending treatment escalated to abusive situations ranging from coercion to rape. The difference between one and the other depended solely on each woman's resistance. But the most disturbing revelation was the role of Lorena Salazar. Throughout the investigation, the wife had maintained a secretive attitude, avoiding any direct involvement. However, Rowe discovered that she not only knew what was going on but actively participated in the cover-up. When a woman tried to escape or threatened to denounce her husband, Lorena would act. First with money, offering them sums that seemed generous but in reality were only intended to buy their silence. When that didn't work, her strategy changed. She tried to convince them that giving in was the only way to avoid problems. Some gave in out of fear, others because they had no choice. Hector's accounts confirmed what Rowe feared. Those who accepted the money disappeared from town without a trace. No one ever spoke of them again. Those who didn't were simply ignored by a system that never investigated enough. It was a perfect circle of impunity, sustained by money, threats, and the fear of their victims. But the final blow came with the latest discovery. Emma Langford had been one of his victims. Salazar had stalked her during her time at the restaurant. But Emma would not be subdued. She resisted his control, refused his advances, and when she made it clear to him that she was leaving for college, that she would never return, the man understood that he was losing her. His control over her was crumbling, and that simply could not be allowed. Emma wanted to escape, but they made sure she never did. That night, Emma Langford's fate was sealed in an unexpected way, at the hands of the people she thought she knew and from whom, in the end, she could not escape. Hector Salazar, owner of the restaurant La Parada del Camino, had been obsessed with Emma for weeks. Her purity, her vow of chastity, fascinated him in an unhealthy way. Ever since Emma rejected his advances and revealed her intention to leave for college, something snapped in Salazar's mind. It was no longer just about controlling her through his work. It had become a pathological obsession. He wanted to dominate her, to possess her in any way possible. The thought that Emma might leave, that her purity might be taken from her by someone else, terrified him. That same night, after Emma finished her shift at the restaurant, Hector and Lorena, his wife, followed her. Hector watched her from his car, while Lorena, fully aware of what was happening, was in the passenger seat. Hector watched as Emma walked alone down the street, a vulnerable figure at that hour, and felt this was his opportunity to approach her. His distorted mind was urging him to act. He wanted her under his control, and he was not going to let this opportunity slip away. When Emma was finally alone on the street, Hector stopped the car and quickly got out. With terrifying determination, he forced her into the vehicle. Emma, terrified, tried to resist, but her strength was nothing compared to that of Hector, who pulled her into the car and ordered her to shut up. Hector's first fatal mistake was to become aware of Carlos's presence. Hector could not let anyone else know what he was doing. The fear of being caught led them to make quick and desperate decisions. In the panic, both Hector and Lorena acted without thinking. To make sure Emma couldn't scream or tell on them, Hector and Lorena quickly covered Emma's mouth, trying to silence her. But fear and panic overcame their control. In an instant of desperation, Hector pressed too hard on Emma's mouth and nose. The suffocation was not intentional. It was an accident. The pressure exerted to silence her proved fatal, and in the blink of an eye, Emma stopped moving. When Hector and Lorena realized what had happened, fear paralyzed them. Emma was dead, and the situation was completely beyond them. Instead of seeking help or facing the consequences, they decided to flee the scene. They left Emma in an isolated field, believing that if they left her there, no one would find them. What seemed to be just another night in the quiet town of Cooperville turned into a tragic mistake. Hector and Lorena, driven by fear and despair, left behind a broken life, believing that their actions would be hidden forever. But little did they know that the truth, sooner or later, would come out. Days later, the case of Hector and Lorena Salazar came to an end in a trial that caught the attention of the entire community. Despite the defense's attempts to present a context of desperation, the evidence of their crimes was irrefutable. The murder of Emma Langford, the kidnapping, and Lorena's active participation in covering up the crime were all considered by the jury. The brutality of the act and the coldness with which both carried out the crime left no room for doubt. The judge, in passing sentence, described the Salazar's actions as monstrous and absolutely unjustifiable. The courtroom was tense silence as the sentence was announced: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for Hector, and life imprisonment with the possibility of appeal for Lorena, due to her role as an accomplice in the crime. The sound of the handcuffs closing on their wrists sealed the fate of both, putting an end to a case that revealed the darkness hidden behind a facade of respect and normality. Case 3. It was a morning like any other in the old Redwood Avenue apartment building. The sound of the dryer in the common laundry room broke the quiet when Otis Henderson, an older tenant, tried to use it. The clothes inside were still strangely warm. When he opened the door, what he found paralyzed him. A woman's body was stuffed inside the dryer. Next to it, an uncapped bottle of bleach rested on the floor, next to a dark blood stain that was beginning to spread across the tiles. The air was laden with a nauseating chemical odor, and the scene, though unusual, left no room for doubt. Someone had placed the corpse there, with macabre precision. Otis ran outside, alerting the police, who quickly cordoned off the area. The scene looked like an accident, but the clues he left behind made it clear that something much darker was brewing in that building. The victim was identified as Jessica Manning, a 24-year-old woman who had been working as a nanny in apartment 12F for 2 years. She cared for her son, Thomas, a 6-year-old boy, and her daily routine consisted of picking him up at 2 p.m. from school and then performing household chores around the house. The Herberson family, who employed her, described her as a charming, dedicated, and responsible girl. When Detective Smith arrived at the apartment, the Herbersons were visibly shaken. Richard, the husband, was stunned, unable to assimilate what had happened, while Linda, his wife, seemed more in control, albeit with a palpable tension. The atmosphere was strange, a mixture of bewilderment and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. In talking with them, the detective soon discovered that Jessica had been in a relationship with a young man named Stephen Johnson. Although the Herbersons didn't know much about him, they mentioned that he was her ex-boyfriend, but didn't seem to have any relevant information about the relationship or his character. Linda, at the mention of Stefan's name, showed mild discomfort, something that did not go unnoticed by Smith. Richard, for his part, was reluctant to delve into the subject, as if he would rather not talk about it at all. The detective noticed that, although the Herbersons seemed sincere in their sadness over Jessica's death, there was something else in their reactions that aroused suspicion. The lack of details about the young woman's personal life or her relationship with Stefan seemed too convenient. Did they really know Jessica as well as they claimed? Or was there more to it than they were willing to admit? Every little reaction, every evasion, was beginning to form a pattern. Something didn't fit, and Smith knew his investigation was just beginning. Stephen Johnson, Jessica Manning's ex-boyfriend, was quickly identified as a key player in the investigation. When questioned, he claimed that the breakup with Jessica had been recent, about a month before the murder, and that it was a mutual decision. However, when Detective Smith showed him the evidence he had obtained from Jessica's voicemail, things took an unexpected turn. The telecommunications operator had provided several voice messages Stefan had left in the days following the breakup. The tone of the recordings revealed a very different story from the one he had told. In the early messages, He was trying to win Jessica back, asking her to reconsider the relationship. But as the days passed and he received no response, Stefan's frustration became more evident. In one of the last messages, his voice became aggressive and full of rage, insulting her and calling her a whore, accusing her of sleeping with anyone and rejecting any attempt at reconciliation. The drastic change in his behavior, from love to hate, was clear. The police showed him these messages during questioning, and Stefan tried to justify himself, claiming that he was hurt and had lost control at the time. However, Detective Smith did not seem convinced by his explanations. The evidence seemed to point to a person who had not accepted the breakup, and the growing anger in his words hinted at a potential motive. Stefan also mentioned that Jessica had started dating another man after their breakup, although he did not offer details about him. In addition, he noted that Jessica's friend Ashley Collins had been the one who got her the nanny job in the Herberson family, suggesting that he might know more about her personal life. However, her alibi at work seemed solid, as several co-workers confirmed that she was present on her shift the day of the murder. Detective Smith wrote down the name Ashley Collins, aware that Jessica's web of relationships was more complex than it initially appeared. Although Stefan had an alibi, the evidence linking him emotionally to the victim was beginning to raise doubts. The investigation was progressing, but the mystery was getting more and more complicated. Ashley Collins, a close friend of Jessica Manning's and also a nanny in the same building, was another important piece in the investigation. It was she who had gotten Jessica the job with the Herberson family, and when questioned, she revealed some details that added a new layer of complexity to the case. Ashley spoke of Jessica fondly, describing her as a nice young woman full of life. However, when Detective Smith asked her about Jessica's personal life, her answers became more evasive. It was then, when pressed, that Ashley blurted out a startling revelation. According to her, Jessica had been having an affair with Richard Herberson, the husband of the family she worked for. Although at first reluctant to go into detail, Ashley explained that when Richard's wife, Linda, got off work late, Jessica stayed home to look after Thomas and occasionally stayed late into the night. Ashley insisted that she didn't want to get in trouble, but the detective noticed that her words were laden with palpable discomfort. She seemed to fear the repercussions of what she was telling, as if she was revealing something she shouldn't have said. However, he did not deny the rumors that there was something more going on between Jessica and Richard, although he could not confirm anything beyond her presence in the house at unusual hours. This information ignited a new line of investigation for Detective Smith. The possibility of a secret relationship between Jessica and Richard Herberson was beginning to take shape. If what Ashley was saying was true, it could have been a motive for a crime of passion, and the tension between the members of that family seemed more complex than initially thought. The next suspect in the investigation, according to Ashley Collins' statements, was Richard Herberson, the father of the child Jessica Manning was caring for. Detective Smith summoned him for questioning at the end of his workday. Richard arrived on the scene with apparent calm, but Smith knew he was about to uncover more key details in the case. When the detective confronted him directly about the relationship with Jessica, Richard did not deny it. He claimed that he had had an affair, but quickly clarified that it was not with Jessica, but with a co-worker. He said that the relationship had ended some time ago and that it had nothing to do with what happened with Jessica. However, the conversation took a turn when Richard explained that, to avoid trouble, he had given Jessica extra money. Richard admitted that he had made payments to Jessica, but not for her work as a nanny. According to him, Jessica had been aware of his infidelity and had agreed to remain silent in exchange for compensation. He had given her extra money to keep her quiet about his relationship with another woman. Smith, surprised by this revelation, continued with his questions. He knew that this could further complicate the case. He then asked if Richard's wife, Linda, might have learned of the situation and reacted violently against Jessica. Richard's answer was evasive. "I don't know," he said, with a somewhat blank look on his face. "I can't predict how Linda would have reacted." The detective, however, began to consider a disturbing possibility. If Linda thought Richard's affair was with Jessica, as Ashley had suggested, Linda's anger might have been much more intense. If she truly believed her husband was betraying her with the nanny, she might have acted out of jealousy and frustration, taking things to an extreme. Although Richard would not confirm it, Detective Smith could not help but think that this situation, fraught with family tensions and secrets, had opened the door to a fatal reaction. With each new statement, the case became more complex. If the payments to Jessica were to keep her quiet about the affair with another woman, how much more was Richard hiding? And if Linda had discovered the truth or misread the situation, could she have killed Jessica in a fit of jealousy? The detective knew there was still much to discover, and that the case was taking an increasingly dangerous turn. With the evidence pointing more and more toward Linda Herberson, Richard's wife, Detective Smith decided to question her. He knew he was in a delicate situation, but he felt that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Linda, who had remained out of the spotlight for much of the investigation, now seemed to be a central figure in the mystery. When confronted, Linda did not deny the tension in her marriage, but revealed a crucial detail that shed light on the motive behind her actions. Linda explained that she had discovered her husband's infidelity thanks to Jessica. Although she did not go into specific details, she hinted that Jessica had been the one who, at some point, had indirectly mentioned Richard's secret relationship to her. It was this, combined with the pain and humiliation of discovering the betrayal, that began to fuel her growing anger. However, at the time of the murder, Linda had a solid alibi. According to her testimony, she was in her lawyer's office, preparing the papers for her divorce. Linda had made the decision to end her marriage, and that afternoon, as tensions peaked, she was concentrating on the legal paperwork. Several people confirmed that she had been in the office at the time of the crime, which gave her a very credible alibi. Although Linda looked like a strong suspect, her alibi remained intact. Detective Smith could not overlook the fact that Richard's wife was in the process of divorce and, moreover, learned of her husband's infidelity from a source as close to the family as Jessica. But she also understood that, being so close to the truth, Linda would probably have lied to the police at first, wanting to keep Richard from knowing that she had already made the decision to separate. That lie, though small in appearance, could be seen as an attempt to protect her plan and keep the divorce a secret while they investigated the crime. The case was at a crossroads. No one's suspect seemed to stand out at the moment, and the evidence, though numerous, did not point to any one person. Detective Smith, however, relied on what had always been his only friend at times like this: the evidence. The autopsy had revealed something important. Jessica Manning had had sex before she died. This was not a rape, but a consensual relationship. This implied that someone in the building was involved, someone with access to the place. The detective focused on details he had previously ignored, such as the elevator security cameras. After reviewing the footage, he noticed something interesting. Jessica had used the elevator on 2 occasions, but on one ride, the ascent time was considerably longer than on the other. The report offered no further details, only that the ride was longer, but did not specify who was with her. This was a crucial piece of information that I could not miss. The next morning, Smith decided to go to the building and, for the first time, stopped in front of the elevator, intending to take a personal tour. He knew he had to understand that ride, to know it up close, in order to find a clue to guide him. He got on the elevator and, with the door closed behind him, he began to ascend slowly, making sure to measure precisely the time it took to reach each floor. And he knew that Jessica was on the 15th floor. Detective Smith, while following the trail of clues inside the building, began to focus on Jessica Manning's personal connections. One link that caught his attention was the one she had with Harris Roger, a musician who lived on the 15th floor of the building. Harris was not only Jessica's neighbor, but he was also the boss of Jessica's close friend Ashley Collins, who worked as a nanny in the same building. Ashley's relationship with Jessica was key, as she had been the one who got her the job with the Herberson family, which explained Jessica's frequent visits to Harris's apartment. When Smith went to ask Harris about his relationship with Jessica, Harris reacted visibly surprised. The detective asked him if he knew Jessica, to which Harris replied in the affirmative, explaining that she was Ashley's friend. Smith then asked him if there was anything else going on between them, since according to the autopsy, Jessica had had sex with someone in the building shortly before she died, and the only connection between her and that place was Harris himself. After a moment's hesitation, Harris admitted that he had indeed had an affair with Jessica. He explained that it had begun a few months ago and that, although the relationship had been brief, it had been enough for Jessica to spend considerable time in his apartment. However, Harris insisted that there was nothing more serious behind the relationship and that Jessica had shown no sign of being in danger when she said goodbye to him that night. Harris's confession left Detective Smith with more questions than answers. Although he admitted the relationship with Jessica, it did not explain why she had been with him just before his death, or how it all related to the murder. The connection seemed clear, but the details were still vague. Smith continued to press, but Harris maintained his version of events, adding no further details about the night of the crime. Despite his confession, the detective felt that Harris was hiding something else, but he still didn't have enough evidence to dig deeper. The only thing that was clear was that Jessica had been in that apartment, and that the relationship with Harris, although short, was a key point in the investigation. Jessica Manning's case was becoming more complicated with each new revelation. Detective Smith had already gathered enough clues that pointed to Harris Roger, but something in the atmosphere of his apartment made him reconsider the situation. Just before he left, as he was about to close the door to Harris's apartment, something caught his attention. Ashley Collins, Jessica's close friend, quickly emerged from one of the bedrooms, wearing only underwear. The gesture was enough to make the detective raise an eyebrow. While he couldn't make any hasty assumptions, something didn't fit at that moment, and the situation, coupled with Ashley's working relationship with Harris, set off a red flag in Smith's mind. Ashley's unexpected appearance, dressed inappropriately, made the detective decide it was time to question her. Something was unclear, and her connection to both Jessica and Harris made her central to the case. Smith knew he had to approach Ashley directly. Detective Smith had already gathered enough clues that pointed to Harris Roger, but something in the atmosphere of his apartment made him reconsider the situation. Just before he left, as he was about to close the door to Harris's apartment, something caught his attention. Ashley Collins, Jessica's close friend, quickly emerged from one of the bedrooms, wearing only underwear. The gesture was enough to make the detective raise an eyebrow. While he couldn't make any hasty assumptions, something didn't fit at that moment, and the situation, coupled with Ashley's working relationship with Harris, set off a red flag in Smith's mind. Ashley's unexpected appearance, dressed inappropriately, made the detective decide it was time to question her. Something was unclear, and her connection to both Jessica and Harris made her central to the case. Smith knew he had to approach Ashley directly. When Ashley was called to testify, her expression changed instantly. The tension was palpable and became increasingly evident as she was forced to face what she had been avoiding with all her might. She admitted that although she had tried to stay out of it, she had known for some time about the relationship between Jessica and her boss, Harris. Although she tried to keep her composure, her emotions began to surface as she confessed that she herself had also had a romantic relationship with him. Ashley explained that despite her close friendship with Jessica, she never imagined that her friend would also share such an intimate connection with Harris. The betrayal was devastating to her, as she not only felt she had been deceived by him, but also by Jessica, who, with the best of intentions, had gotten her the job with the Herberson family. At that moment, she realized that the wound was even deeper. Not only had her boss been unfaithful to her, but her close friend, the very person who had helped her integrate into that environment, had been involved with him as well, which left her completely shattered. That day, Ashley, unable to control her anger, followed Jessica into the building's laundry room. It was there, within the cold walls of that small space, that the conversation quickly escalated. In a fit of jealousy, Ashley confronted Jessica. The words became harsher and harsher, and Ashley's anger, already boiling over, erupted impulsively. In a fit of rage, she grabbed a nearby bleach bottle and, without thinking, slammed it into Jessica's head with full force. The impact was brutal, and Jessica fell to the floor, hitting her head on a table. She was instantly knocked unconscious, unresponsive. But Ashley's fury didn't end there. Instead of stopping, panic overtook her. Determined to cover up what had happened, she grabbed Jessica's body and, as if her mind was on autopilot, dragged her to the dryer, convinced that the heat would destroy any evidence. She turned on the machine in the hope of erasing any evidence that might incriminate her. The motive for the murder, as Detective Smith soon discovered, was an explosive mixture of jealousy and betrayal. Ashley felt betrayed not only by her friend, but also by her boss and lover. She felt that everything she had done for Jessica, from giving her the job to giving her her trust, had been in vain. When Smith connected all the dots, he understood that, although Harris was indirectly responsible for the crime because of his selfishness and the relationship he had with both women, he would face no legal consequences. Harris, although he was a key player in creating the conflict, was not the one who committed the murder. The real culprit was Ashley Collins. Driven by anger and the pain of betrayal, she took her friend's life. With Ashley's confession, the case finally came to a conclusion. Ashley was arrested and prosecuted for the murder of Jessica Manning. While Detective Smith was relieved to have solved the crime, he also reflected on the destructive power of jealousy and betrayal. That the friendship and trust between two women disintegrated so tragically over an act of personal revenge was a lesson in the consequences of human emotions run amok. Anger and jealousy, once unleashed, can destroy lives in the blink of an eye. Case 4. On March 22nd, in an office building in downtown Chicago, the sound of a phone ringing unanswered alerted the receptionist on the 14th floor. As she approached Margaret Lively's office door, she noticed it was ajar. She pushed cautiously and saw it. Margaret was in her chair, motionless, with a dark stain spreading across her blouse. A single stab wound to the chest, direct and precise. There was no sign of a struggle. On her desk, jumbled papers, a lamp dropped on the floor, and her computer screen still on, displaying an unimportant mail. The locked window on the inside ruled out forced entry. The door had no signs of violence. Everything indicated that Margaret knew her killer. Margaret Lively, 46, was a businesswoman with an impeccable track record in the financial world. As the majority shareholder of Lively and Company, a strategic consulting firm with million-dollar contracts in the technology sector, she had built her reputation as a discerning and calculating leader. Her keen business acumen led her to expand the company internationally, making her an influential figure in the industry. Although Margaret avoided the press, her name was circulating in corporate and financial circles. In recent weeks, rumors of a possible sale of the company began to gain momentum. The transaction, if completed, would have meant a complete restructuring, affecting partners and employees. Some saw the sale as an expansion strategy. Others considered it a betrayal. His personal life was more reserved. He never married or had children, and kept his close circle limited to a few trusted friends and colleagues. But in the business world, trust was a rare commodity. If the rumors were true, Margaret had more than one enemy, and some had a lot to lose. The case was left in the hands of Detective Elliot Grayson, a veteran of the Chicago Police Department with more than 20 years of solving high-profile crimes. From the outset, he knew it would not be an easy case. Margaret Lively had no immediate family, and her personal life seemed as calculated as her business. One thing was certain, however: a woman of her stature didn't handle everything alone. People like her often had personal assistants, people who knew her schedule, her meetings, and, most importantly, her secrets. That was where the investigation would begin. Detective Elliot Grayson arrived at Claire Donovan's home early in the morning. Her address was on the company's records, a discreet apartment on the north side of Chicago. He knocked on the door and waited. It was several seconds before it opened. Claire received him without a trace of surprise. She was impeccable, with her hair up and formal clothes, despite being at home. Her expression was neutral, devoid of any obvious emotion upon hearing the reason for the visit. She ushered him in without objection and led him into a small room where the morning light illuminated a tidy work table. On his computer screen, several open emails showed resumes sent to different companies. Claire was not in mourning. She was busy. Before Grayson could ask, she clarified her situation. She had been fired a week before the murder. Margaret didn't explain, simply told him she was no longer needed and that he could pack up his things. After 10 years working at her side, the cut was abrupt. The answer left the detective with more questions than answers. Such a dismissal without warning usually had a reason, so he pressed a little harder. Claire didn't hesitate to respond. Not only did she work for Margaret, she was also her lover. Their relationship had begun years ago, discreetly and without commitment, but over time it became more intense. They were not a couple, but neither were they simply employer and assistant. Claire became Margaret's confidant in and out of the office. However, what started out as a no-strings-attached arrangement became awkward. Claire wanted to end it, but Margaret was not used to rejection. Although there were never any threats or direct conflict, things changed between them. Claire became expendable. A week before the murder, after another failed attempt at rapprochement, Margaret made a decision. He fired her. There was no discussion, just a curt phrase and an order to pack up her things. Grayson silently took note. The situation explained Claire's attitude. She wasn't sad or angry. She was indifferent, perhaps because her relationship with Margaret had ended on bad terms, or perhaps because she had simply never been emotionally involved. Before the detective could leave, Claire added one last detail. Margaret's partner, Daniel Carter, was furious about the possible sale of the company. In the weeks leading up to it, his arguments with Margaret had become constant, intense. Carter saw the sale as a betrayal, as the end of everything they had built together. The information was valuable, but Claire's coldness was still disturbing. She showed no affection for Margaret, not even resentment, just absolute detachment, as if the death of her former boss meant nothing. For Grayson, that made her someone he could not dismiss. Cold, calculating, and above all, emotionally unattached to the victim. After his visit to Claire Donovan, Detective Elliot Grayson returned to the Lively and Company building. He needed to speak with Daniel Carter, Margaret Lively's partner and now the company's majority shareholder after her death. The atmosphere in the office was tense. Margaret's murder had plunged the company into a state of uncertainty. Employees spoke in whispers, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might be connected to the investigation. Some knew that the future of the company depended on what happened in the next few days, and others were simply trying to stay out of the tragedy. Grayson arrived at Carter's office and didn't wait for an invitation. He knocked on the door once and entered. Carter stood at the window, arms folded, staring out at the city. Unlike others, he didn't look nervous or surprised. Rather, he looked tired, as if his mind was elsewhere. He didn't flinch at the sight of the detective. Without mincing words, Grayson told him about the sale of the company. It was impossible to ignore the coincidence. Margaret was about to sell her controlling interest, and Carter, who for years had been her partner, would be relegated to a secondary role. The detective did not believe in coincidences. Carter sighed heavily and turned slowly to face him. He denied nothing. The sale of the company was real, and Margaret had given him no choice. They had been arguing for weeks, and she had made it clear that the decision had been made. With the new company structure, he would lose power, influence, and possibly his position on the board. Years of work would vanish with a single signature. If the deal went through, everything he had built with Margaret would be in the hands of a competitor. But now, with Margaret dead, everything changed. The sale was on hold. Carter, as majority shareholder after her death, had absolute control over the company. The same transaction that would have ruined him was now completely in his hands. Grayson noted the coincidence. If Margaret had made the sale, Carter would have lost everything. Now, with her out of the way, he had exactly what he needed. But before the detective could press the issue, Carter raised an eyebrow and added something else. On the day of the murder, there was a fight in Margaret's office. She did not know all the details, but the altercation was loud and did not go unnoticed. Her boyfriend and the prospective buyer of the company, a competing executive, argued aggressively in her office. Carter was not present at the fight, but the shouting was loud enough for some employees to notice. No one knew exactly what had happened, but the fact that a buyer and Margaret's partner confronted each other in her office on the same day of her murder was too significant to ignore. Grayson was silent for a moment. Carter had reason to want Margaret gone, but the information he had just provided opened up a new line of inquiry. If the sale of the company wasn't Margaret's only problem and there were conflicts in her personal life, there was more than one person with motive to kill her. The detective took note of every detail and watched Carter one last time before leaving. Cold, calculating, and with most of his fortune at stake. He couldn't rule it out yet, but there were more pieces on the board now. Detective Elliot Grayson was quick to identify the buyer of Margaret Lively's company. It was Miles Hamilton, a high-ranking employee at the competing company, Brady & Company, specifically in the finance department. Hamilton had his sights set on Lively & Company not only because of the opportunity the purchase represented, but because of what was to follow. If he could close the deal, he would become a majority shareholder in the newly merged company, a position that in time could lead to even greater power within the industry. Grayson headed to Brady & Company headquarters for an interview. The atmosphere in the office was tense, and Hamilton did not seem surprised by the visit. On the contrary, he greeted him with a calmness that could have been interpreted as nervousness in disguise. When the detective asked him about his relationship with Margaret, Hamilton, at first, seemed reticent, but then, in an unexpected twist, began to talk more than Grayson expected. The buyer revealed that his relationship with Margaret went far beyond the professional. They had been having an affair for months, a secret relationship, but obvious to those who paid attention to detail. Initially, it was casual, no strings attached. However, as so often happens, things got complicated, and the two began to see their lives become intertwined. Despite what could have been a simple office romance, Hamilton and Margaret became lovers. That day, the day of the murder, he had gone to Margaret's office to talk about the purchase. She was hesitant about closing the deal, and he had gone to try to convince her to make the right decision. However, his strategy was not only argumentative but also emotional. He tried to seduce her, hoping that in a moment of vulnerability, she would make the decision he wanted. What Hamilton didn't know was that Margaret had a boyfriend much younger than she was, something that most people in Margaret's professional environment were unaware of. The young man showed up at the office, unannounced. When he saw what was going on between Margaret and Hamilton, the scene quickly escalated into a confrontation. Hamilton, shocked and bewildered, had no idea that Margaret was in a serious relationship. The shock was immediate. Margaret's boyfriend started yelling at them and accusing them, furious at what he was seeing. What at first seemed like a simple disagreement quickly escalated into a fight. The shouting and scuffling alerted building security, who quickly arrived and separated those involved. Margaret's boyfriend, still agitated, was escorted out of the building. But in the chaos, Margaret seemed overwhelmed, almost as if the situation had caused her to make a rash decision. Hamilton left the office that day not knowing exactly what to think. He hadn't expected Margaret to have a boyfriend, let alone be so young. He was surprised and upset by the situation, but above all, he didn't understand how the dynamics of the buyout could have been so complicated by something so personal. He thought the relationship with Margaret might influence his decision, but the boyfriend's unexpected appearance changed everything. What Hamilton didn't know was that this episode would be crucial to the investigation. When Grayson asked him about the altercation, the buyer explained it offhandedly, as if being part of a couple's fight was trivial, but the truth was that the argument reflected much more than it seemed at first glance. Could it have had something to do with the murder? The scene of jealousy, the struggle for control, The confrontation? Everything seemed to indicate that there was something else behind this self-assured buyer. Although his motives for killing her were not obvious, Margaret's death could have been the worst possible turn of events for Hamilton, who had already lost what he wanted most. With the sale on hold and the company under the control of others, Hamilton, it seemed, was the last person to want Margaret dead. However, the questions remained many. Detective Elliot Grayson soon discovers a darker, more personal aspect of Margaret Lively's life. Her relationship with Leo Hartman, a man 13 years her junior. For a time, Leo was her partner, but the relationship ended abruptly and recently. However, the young man, who was just 25 years old, had not been able to overcome the end of what he saw as the best stage of his life. Margaret had been more than a girlfriend to Leo. To him, she represented stability, power, and above all, a life without financial worries. Margaret had been his breadwinner. She paid his bills, gave him luxuries that a man of his age without a stable career could not have afforded. So when she decided to break off the relationship, he didn't take the blow. He did so not only because of his love for her, but also out of fear that his comfortable life would fall apart. In his mind, the end of their relationship meant losing everything he had ever had, and this feeling morphed into something much darker: obsession. Leo began sending strange and constant messages to Margaret, sometimes regretful, sometimes resentful, reminding her of everything she had given him and how much he had loved her. Each attempt by Margaret to cut ties for good only infuriated him more. One afternoon, Leo arrived unexpectedly at the offices of Lively and Company with the excuse of talking to Margaret. He was determined to win her back, or at least make her see what she had lost. When he entered the building, the atmosphere was already tense. News of the sale of the company and the falling out with competing partners was circulating in the corridors. For Leo, however, those details were irrelevant at the moment. He just wanted to talk to Margaret. Arriving at his office, Leo didn't expect what he would find. Margaret was not alone. Miles Hamilton, the company's buyer, was there with her. What Leo saw next, however, left him cold and furious. Margaret and Hamilton were having sex. The scene he encountered was as unexpected as it was humiliating. She, with whom he had been in such an intense relationship, was now shamelessly giving herself to another man. The scene was a brutal blow to Leo, and his reaction was immediate. Anger, rage, and jealousy overcame him instantly. It was not only an emotional betrayal but a public humiliation. He rushed up to them, shouting at them, accusing them of everything, demanding answers. Hamilton tried to remain calm, but Leo's behavior had already gotten out of control. The tension in the air became unbearable, and words turned to shoving. The chaos of the fight broke out so quickly that there was no time for anything else. Building security quickly intervened. Leo was dragged out of the office, his face red with fury and humiliation. But even though he had been ejected, something inside him still burned. He couldn't understand what had just happened, what he had lost, what he considered a betrayal. Margaret, who had once cared for him and kept him, was now giving herself to another man, someone she was clearly willing to move on with. That was not the last time Leo was there. A few hours later, he returned uninvited. This time, however, Margaret ignored him completely. She didn't want to get involved anymore, and he knew it. Leo was overcome with rage, but Margaret, seemingly unperturbed, paid no attention to him. She was focused on her own problems, the company's deals, the possible sale, the complex situation with her partners, and her own personal life that was slowly falling apart. But on his way back, Leo noticed something that gave him pause. He saw Claire Donovan, Margaret's former assistant, enter the building, as if she had a purpose of her own. Leo didn't understand what was happening at the time, but the sight of Claire entering the offices was enough to unsettle him. What was she doing there? Detective Grayson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the interrogation table. He stared at Claire Donovan and told her that security cameras and time records confirmed that she had been the last person to see Margaret alive. There was no room for denial. Claire knew it. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and began to speak. That night, after spending hours looking for work without success, he returned to Margaret's office. It had been a terrible day, full of rejection and frustration. Losing her position at the company meant not only losing her income, but also feeling that years of hard work and loyalty had been for nothing. She was desperate. She went into the office hoping that Margaret would reconsider her decision, that she would give her another chance, that she would recognize all that she had done for her during her time as an assistant. But when she tried to reason with Margaret, pleading with her to give her her job back, the response was cold and curt. "Get out." Claire explained that this order had a clear meaning for her. For years, "get down under the desk" had been an unspoken signal, an instruction she never disputed or questioned. It was part of a dynamic that she always felt was unequal and humiliating. To Margaret, Claire was someone inferior, a tool she could use without offering anything in return. There was never any emotional or professional recognition. In the company, she was always treated as invisible, while others, like Leo, received all the attention and privileges. Margaret seemed to give everything to Leo effortlessly, while Claire only received orders and contempt. That night, while obeying Margaret's order, Claire noticed something that shook her deeply: traces of semen on Margaret's underwear. The discovery was devastating. Margaret had just been with someone else, probably Leo, just before giving that same order to her. For Claire, that was the last straw. It was no longer just the usual humiliation. Now it was a cruel taunt, a way of rubbing it in her face that she would never be more than a disposable option. Rage raged through her uncontrollably. Every moment of humiliation, every broken promise, every time Margaret ignored her or treated her as invisible, exploded inside her like an unstoppable storm. In an impulsive act, she picked up a sharp glass ornament lying on the desk and plunged it into Margaret's chest. She didn't do it with the thought of killing her, but as an instinctive reaction, an outlet for years of pent-up resentment. The wound was enough to weaken Margaret, however. Grayson listened intently, mentally reconstructing the scene. As Claire finished her confession, Grayson felt he finally understood the complexity of the relationship surrounding Margaret. Claire was not simply a fired assistant. She was a woman deeply damaged by years of emotional abuse and manipulation. Days later, Claire Donovan's trial attracted local and even national press attention. The image of a seemingly calm and professional woman turned into the alleged perpetrator of a brutal murder shocked public opinion. However, neither the accumulated frustration of years of unequal treatment nor the emotions that Claire had overflowed during her confession were enough to cause the jury to hesitate. The evidence presented was clear and compelling. The security cameras, the office records, the traces of desperation in Claire's words, and the marks of the fatal wound on Margaret's body demonstrated more than just an impulsive reaction. The evidence of a violent, albeit impulsive act was classified as premeditated. The trial culminated in a unanimous verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Claire's defense of overflowing emotions and constant manipulation was not enough to mitigate the weight of her final action. The judge, in passing sentence, called her actions an overreaction to years of emotional abuse, but also made it clear that excessive violence could not be justified. What began as a protest against humiliation was transformed into an irreversible act of violence, the judge said. The cold, definitive sound of the courtroom gavel broke the air as the sentence was handed down. 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The courtroom fell completely silent, and Claire was escorted out of the courtroom. As her footsteps echoed empty, the case, marked by years of manipulation, frustration, and a tragic ending, left a scar on the community that would never fade. Case 5. On January 7th, in a quiet neighborhood in Seattle, Washington, the day began like any other. By mid-morning, however, a neighbor's desperate scream shattered the calm. Someone had found something terrible in her backyard shed, forcing the police to intervene immediately. When the officers arrived, what they found was enough to freeze even the most experienced investigators in their tracks. Inside an old refrigerator, hidden in the fog and the foul smell of decomposition, lay the body of a young woman so deteriorated as to be almost unrecognizable. She was barely 19 years old. No one knew how she had gotten there, or who had left her in that state. At first, the cause of death seemed difficult to determine, but the scene suggested something more sinister than a simple accident. The place was full of details that added to the bewilderment. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, and the refrigerator, although in poor condition, seemed to have been deliberately used to hide the body. The investigators felt as if they were faced with a macabre puzzle that had to be solved as soon as possible. DNA tests performed on the body revealed that the young woman found in the refrigerator was indeed Megan Albright, a 19-year-old dancer who was well known in the local art scene. She came from a wealthy family, the Albrights, who owned several commercial properties in Seattle. Despite her youth, Megan had made a name for herself on the dance scene, working with major companies and participating in charity galas. Despite her professional success, her personal life was more complicated than many thought. Her parents, influential in high society, had always been concerned about the circle of people their daughter associated with, but they never imagined that something so macabre could happen to her. The detective in charge of the case, Thomas Grayson, was already on his way to the Albright residence. He knew the situation was delicate, and that confronting Megan's parents would not be easy. There was something in the family atmosphere that he couldn't help but sense, a pressure of image and appearances that could hide dark secrets. It was unclear to Grayson whether they would be helpful, or if, on the contrary, they would be trying to cover something up. But one thing was clear: he had to get answers, and Megan's parents would be the key to getting started. Megan Albright's parents greeted Detective Grayson with a mixture of uncertainty and anguish. In the quiet living room of their home, surrounded by happy memories, they began to recount their daughter's life, a bright young woman full of promise who had taken a dark turn that even they could not understand. Megan had always been a child prodigy in dance. From a very young age, her love for the art led her to shine in every performance. For her parents, seeing their daughter on stage was an indescribable source of pride, a dream come true. However, at the age of 17, a leg injury forced her to stop her dance career. Rehabilitation was long, painful, and although she was initially determined to return, the process was never the same. The Megan they knew slowly began to fade away, replaced by a young woman full of frustration and resentment. In her isolation, Megan began to withdraw from her family, refusing her parents' visits and concerns. What began as simple disappointment at not being able to dance again soon morphed into erratic behavior. She joined a group of friends her parents never quite got to know, and nights out became a constant in her life. The dancing that had once given her purpose was replaced by something more destructive. It was then, after several failed attempts to help her, that Megan decided to move away from home. She found a group of friends with whom she moved in, without giving them many details about her new life. From that point on, the Albrights lost close contact with their daughter. Visits became increasingly sporadic, and phone calls became rare. The gap between them and Megan grew larger with each passing day. Her parents felt that the young girl was no longer the same, that their daughter had completely disappeared behind that facade of rebelliousness and silence. The Albrights' concerns intensified when, at age 18, Megan fell into the world of drugs. At first, they tried to help her, but each attempt was rebuffed. The young woman, caught in a spiral of addiction, began to become increasingly distant, colder, and more hidden. Her relationship with her family broke down, to the point where they no longer knew who their daughter really was. The hardest blow came 11 months before her death, when Megan was kidnapped. The case shocked the family, but something didn't fit. The police had begun negotiations for her release, but suddenly the case broke down for no apparent reason. No one could explain why, but the kidnapping left many questions unanswered. The family, after weeks of anguish, began to wonder if perhaps the kidnapping had been faked. Some even came to believe that Megan had faked the whole thing as a desperate way to get money for drugs, taking advantage of her parents' distress. The detective's next stop was at Megan's last place of employment, a pharmacy where she had been a manager before being fired. There, Detective Grayson encountered Carla Jenkins, a young woman just over 25 years old, who had been in a close relationship with Megan during her last few months. Carla had been a colleague of Megan's and upon learning of her drug problems had tried on several occasions to help her. Carla explained that at first, Megan seemed to have everything under control, but after an injury she suffered while dancing, her life began to fall apart. Megan began using drugs to deal with the pain and eventually fell into a self-destructive spiral. When she was fired for stealing drugs from the pharmacy, things got even worse. Carla, concerned for her friend, tried to intervene, but Megan was already too caught up in her addiction. Carla could not believe what was happening to the young woman she had considered a close friend. Despite her best efforts, Megan never seemed willing to change, and worst of all, her addiction had led her to distance herself from everyone, even her own family. Carla tried to do what she could to support her. In a desperate gesture, she offered Megan to live with her and her husband, Greg. At first, Megan accepted the offer and moved in with them. Although at first she seemed willing to change, the relationship quickly became strained. Carla and her husband did their best to be good hosts, but visits to the home became less and less frequent. Megan, though grateful, was not ready to face her problems. On many occasions, Megan would disappear for days at a time, and even if she returned, the atmosphere grew heavier and heavier. It wasn't just the addiction that was alienating Megan. There was also the fact that her relationships with others didn't seem to last. Carla and Greg, though they tried to be supportive, couldn't help but feel helpless as they watched Megan turn down the opportunities offered to her. From time to time, Carla also saw Megan accompanied by a boy, but she could never know much more about it. Sometimes the young woman seemed to be calm, but there was always something fleeting in their glances, something that Carla could not fully understand. When Carla would ask about him, Megan would only answer evasively, as if she didn't want to give details. Carla didn't know if this boy was just a momentary distraction for Megan, or if he was involved in some deeper way in her life. However, this young man's appearances became less and less frequent, as did Megan's visits. Finally, after several arguments and tensions, Megan stopped living with them. Although she continued to visit the house from time to time, her presence became increasingly sporadic. During the last few months, Carla barely heard from Megan. It was clear that something in her life had definitely broken, and no one knew for sure what had happened to her until her body was finally found in such a heartbreaking condition. The last time Carla saw Megan was months before her death, when the young woman visited her briefly. They never imagined that those would be her last words. Detective Grayson continued his investigation and turned to Ethan Rivera, a close friend of Megan. Throughout their friendship, Ethan had witnessed Megan's transformation, from her days as a promising young dancer to her fall into drugs. In good times, Megan had been generous to him, providing him with money and favors when things were going well. As time went on, however, Megan's situation worsened, and their relationship began to change. Her drug addiction became deeper, and although Ethan tried to help her, things were no longer so simple. In the last few weeks, Megan began coming to Ethan's house more frequently, seeking refuge. At first, he accepted her without hesitation, but soon realized that the situation was becoming more difficult. Ethan didn't have many resources, and Megan's demands for money and help became more and more demanding. Megan's desperation for money for her vices seemed endless. Ethan, who was also struggling financially, could no longer support her as he had before. The situation became tense and uncomfortable. Megan was beginning to ask more of him than he could give her, and their relationship began to become more strained and fraught with resentment. Like many of those around Megan in her final days, Ethan began to notice signs that she was not acting with full transparency. Megan began to talk about extreme situations, about doing something drastic to get what she needed, and how she felt her life was out of control. Although she didn't mention it directly, Ethan began to wonder if Megan was considering doing something beyond what he could comprehend, something that would make him uncomfortable if he thought about it. When Detective Grayson raised with him the possibility that Megan had faked a kidnapping to get money or attention, Ethan was nervous. Although he had not considered it concretely at the time, he began to recall certain conversations and attitudes of Megan's that now seemed to fit the idea of a self-kidnapping. Megan had talked about extreme situations and had mentioned the need to do something drastic to get money, something that might involve manipulation or an attempt to get what she wanted at all costs. Although Ethan was uncomfortable admitting it, he couldn't help but think that, in retrospect, Megan's words and behavior might have been a sign that something darker was at play. Although he never thought Megan could go that far, he now understood that her desperate situation might have led her to make extreme decisions, even risking her own life to get what she wanted. Detective Grayson sensed the tension in Ethan's words. Although there was no direct confession, Ethan's words suggested that at some point, Megan may have been planning something to manipulate those around her. What at first appeared to be a simple friendship of mutual aid was now revealing itself to be a complicated relationship, fraught with desperation. Ethan's confusion and nervousness only added to the mystery of the case, and the detective knew that the key to unraveling the truth lay in the details yet to be discovered. Finally, Ethan, with a defeated look on his face, mentioned that when Megan was completely overwhelmed, she confessed to him that she planned to go to Carla's husband, Greg, for help. Ethan, still hesitant, admitted that he didn't quite understand what she wanted to do with him, but it was clear that Megan was hoping for some kind of solution to her problems through Greg. The mention of Greg ignited a new spark in Grayson's mind. He was a code name, someone Megan had probably felt comfortable with or believed she could get some support from. This only further complicated the connections between people close to Megan. The detective knew his next stop should be to talk to Greg, but the climate of suspicion around everyone involved was growing, and he would soon realize that what appeared to be a simple case of substance abuse could have much deeper roots. Detective Grayson arrived at Greg's house with a palpable sense of unease. The home, small in size, and with the air of a family not going through its best times, seemed to fit the stories that had been heard. However, something in the atmosphere told him that there was still much to discover. Greg greeted him with restrained nervousness, accompanied by his wife, who was equally tense. They both insisted that Megan was no longer to be seen there, that she had long since distanced herself from them. It seemed like a well-rehearsed version, but Grayson couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was then that something in the kitchen caught her attention. In one corner, a gleaming new refrigerator stood out in the space. The rest of the house didn't suggest any recent improvements, much less such an expensive purchase. Grayson took a closer look before casually asking about it. Greg predictably looked uncomfortable. He claimed he had only recently purchased it, not giving the matter any further thought. But Grayson was no novice, and something in that answer rang hollow, forced. It was the question about the old refrigerator that made Greg the most uneasy. The man hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. Finally, he said he had given it away, but avoided going into details. He couldn't tell Grayson to whom or when. The silence between them grew heavy, and Greg's discomfort was increasingly palpable. There was something more to that story, something Greg didn't want to reveal. Grayson, however, was not willing to let it go so easily. He observed the details, the gestures, the little unspoken lies. The detective began to put the pieces together in his mind, connecting the doubts about Megan, the sudden disappearance, and the unexplained presence of the refrigerator. Each passing second increased the suspicion that Greg knew more than he was willing to admit. When the air in the room became too thick, Grayson made the decision to act. With a quick, precise movement, he placed the handcuffs on Greg's wrists. The man, completely overwhelmed with tension, stepped back. The tension between the two became unbearable as Grayson pushed him toward the door, taking Greg with him. Greg's wife watched silently, her face marked by fear. As he left the house, the detective felt the pieces begin to fall into place. The refrigerator, though a seemingly insignificant detail, had been the key to uncovering something much bigger. Grayson knew that this was only the beginning. that the truth was closer, but still far from being revealed. Something sinister lurked in the shadows, and Megan's true story was yet to be uncovered. The interrogation room was completely silent. Greg was sitting across from Detective Grayson, his face reflecting the fatigue and tension that had built up over the past few hours. Grayson watched him calmly, waiting for the man to speak. He knew that the confession was about to come out. He only had to wait for the right moment. Finally, Greg broke the silence. With his eyes downcast and his voice wavering, he began to relate what had happened. He explained that it had all started when Megan came to his house with a desperate idea to carry out a self-kidnapping. They both knew they needed money urgently, and she thought that if they faked a kidnapping and sent pictures to her family, they could get what they needed. Although Greg was initially unsure of the idea, he eventually agreed, believing it wouldn't be that complicated. Megan anxiously reached into the refrigerator to take the pictures they planned to send. Just then, Greg's wife, Carla, arrived at the house. Greg rushed out to talk to her and explain the situation, assuring her that it was only for a few minutes. However, when he returned, the situation had changed drastically. Megan was already dead. Detective Grayson, in a firm tone, pointed out that Megan's body showed clear signs of weakness due to the drugs. This made her much more vulnerable, which allowed her to not resist the asphyxiation attempt. The young woman, in her dependent state, could not fight to save her life. Greg continued, his voice trembling, explaining that upon seeing what had happened, he and Carla decided to hide the body. They knew that with the state she was in, no one would be able to identify her easily. They decided to put the body in the refrigerator, waiting for decomposition to do the rest of the work. The idea was that, as the days passed and the body deteriorated, no one would be able to recognize Megan when they found her. Greg's account was a mixture of despair and guilt. He knew that everything had gotten out of his control, but he was clinging to his version of events, as if trying to justify what had happened. Grayson, for his part, listened in silence, processing every word. Greg's confession was clear. The trial against Greg and Carla came to an end, with clear evidence that their involvement in Megan's death was not a simple accident. The combination of testimony, forensic evidence, and inconsistencies in their statements were determinative. The cause of Megan's death, asphyxiation due to lack of oxygen, along with the manipulation of the abduction photos and the concealment of the body, was enough for the court to conclude that it was not an error in judgment, but a series of premeditated decisions. Greg tried to defend himself by arguing that it was all an accident, but the court did not accept his version. Carla, although less directly involved in the death, was convicted of concealment. The defense of both was not enough to avoid conviction. The verdict was clear. Greg was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and Carla to 25 years, without the possibility of parole. The judge made it clear that desperation does not justify violence, and that the subsequent cover-up only aggravated the crime. When the sentence was passed, the case was closed, but Megan's tragedy left a mark on all who knew her. Desperation, lies, and manipulation led to a fatal outcome, and the trial concluded with the certainty that not everything can be justified, even in the darkest moments. Part 6. On February 8th, police found a human hand in Central Park, separated from the body. What was disturbing was not only the find itself, but what was on the palm, the number 21 written in black ink, and a ring on the little finger. Detective John Harrington took over the case. While investigating, he remembered that the number 21 is key to the game of blackjack, common in casinos. This led him to visit several local casinos. After reviewing the records, he discovered that some people associated with recent gambling were linked to the victim. As the investigation progressed, Harrington realized that the number 21 was not just a clue, but a sign of the gambling world. The connection between the victim and the casino could be the key to solving the case. After conducting forensic tests on the found hand, it was determined that it belonged to Carl Meyer, owner of a major casino and spa in Nevada. Police rushed to his establishment surrounding it to investigate. After a thorough inspection, they discovered Meyer's body in the basement, inside a freezer. When forensic examiners examined Carl Meyer's body, they discovered that the cause of his death had been blunt trauma to the head, probably caused by a blunt force trauma. However, what really caught the investigators' attention was the peculiar way in which his hand had been severed. The mutilation did not seem to be a coincidence but a message, an act that mobsters often perform to send warnings to their victims. Given Meyer's occupation as a casino owner in Nevada, it was not difficult for the police to link this type of cut with criminal practices related to the world of illegal gambling and betting. The connection to organized crime was obvious, but many questions remained unanswered. Carl Meyer came from an immigrant family that eventually built an entertainment empire. His father, a visionary in the casino business, left him a legacy of success and power in Nevada. By the time he was 45, Carl owned one of the most luxurious and profitable casinos in the region, as well as an exclusive spa that attracted high-profile clients. Although his personal life was discreet, Meyer maintained relationships with influential figures in the business and criminal worlds. His name was known in luxury circles, but he was also embroiled in rumors of dealings with the local mafia. Despite his success, his life was marked by the constant pressure of running a multi-million-dollar empire and the shadow of violence that often stalked those who operated in his world. The first person Detective Harrington decided to talk to was Jennifer Meyer, the wife of the late Carl Meyer. Although she did not initially come across as a direct suspect, the fact that her husband was connected to mob circles and the casino world raised certain doubts. Jennifer had maintained a quiet life, at least from the outside, but the tensions in her marriage did not go unnoticed. Jennifer Meyer, a woman with a serious face and reserved demeanor, was visibly nervous during the interrogation. There was something about her demeanor that didn't fit. As the detective progressed through the questions, she gradually opened up, but always with a defensive attitude. At a key moment, Jennifer admitted to an extramarital affair with Matt Etienne, the head of security at the casino Carl Meyer ran. Although she said so reluctantly, she made it clear that the relationship was not based on love, but on a search for affection and companionship that had been absent in her marriage to Carl. For years, Carl became increasingly involved in the problems of his business and his casino, which took him emotionally away from his wife. Jennifer explained that, over the years, her relationship with Carl had cooled. His ambition and control over her life, especially with the casino, were wearing down the relationship. Carl seemed to live in a parallel world, one that did not include his wife and daughter. Although Jennifer never openly admitted it in public, her bond with Matt Etienne had been a way to escape that emotional loneliness. However, she made it clear that she never intended for the situation to become anything more dangerous. Her relationship with Matt was simply an escape valve, something to distract her from the emptiness she felt in her marital life. The detective also discovered that Jennifer feared for her safety because of Carl's problems with the mob. Although she did not have precise details, she had always heard rumors, and her intuition told her that Carl's life was in constant danger, something he had never fully disclosed to her. This fear, coupled with his infidelity, seemed to be creating an atmosphere of despair in Jennifer's life. However, she denied having any direct involvement in her husband's death. Although she had acknowledged her relationship with Matt Etienne, she insisted that she had never wanted things to get to that point. What really began to catch the detective's attention was how the tension between Jennifer, Carl, and those involved in the casino business seemed to have created an untenable situation. While Carl's wife had never mentioned that her marriage pushed her to commit a crime, the pieces were beginning to fit together in an unsettling way. Matt Etienne's presence and mob problems could not be ignored. Jennifer had been trapped in a life that kept her isolated, both emotionally and physically, while Carl's secrets and threats continued to grow around her. Detective Harrington turned his attention to Matt Etienne, the head of security at the Meyer Casino. Although outwardly a calm and calculating man, Etienne was one of the prime suspects in the murder of Karl Meyer. His relationship with Jennifer Meyer, the victim's wife, had been confirmed, but what really put Etienne under the microscope was his exclusive access to the casino's security cameras. As head of security, Etienne had the ability to watch not only employees, but everyone who entered the casino, and his records were an invaluable resource for any investigation. For weeks, Etienne had noticed the recurring presence of a man in the casino. He was no ordinary gambler, nor was he an unnoticed visitor. This man, whom Etienne did not initially recognize, seemed to know the place well, but he kept off the radar, avoiding any interaction with the employees. The stranger's disconcerting appearance occurred at unusual times, in the casino's off hours, when most of the regulars had already left. Etienne, at first, thought he was nothing more than a rare customer. However, something about his behavior disturbed him. The man never stayed long, and, strangest of all, he didn't seem to be there to gamble. He observed the place with a coldness that did not fit the atmosphere of the casino. Whenever he appeared, he exchanged furtive glances with some of the employees, and on a couple of occasions he had even approached the restricted area, where access was limited. The employees he spoke to seemed uncomfortable, and that made Etienne even more uneasy. Security camera recordings showed the man crossing paths with Karl Meyer several times, always at key moments when casino business was being conducted in the shadows. Etienne, having access to these recordings, could not help but feel increasingly puzzled. This man's presence in the casino was no longer a mere coincidence. Harrington, reviewing the recordings with Etienne, began to connect the dots. He knew that the stranger was not only connected to the casino in some way, but was possibly a direct contact of the mob. The connection between the mobster and Meyer was becoming increasingly clear, and the fact that Etienne had witnessed his entry into the casino, along with the possible complicity of several employees, was beginning to point to a dark path. Finally, after several attempts to downplay the matter, Etienne relented and admitted that there was something he had not told. The figure he had observed on the recordings was someone who was well known in certain circles, especially in the underworld of organized crime. He was a mobster with deep connections in Nevada, someone who, according to Etienne, had the power to run the shadows of the city undetected. In a whisper, Etienne blurted out the name Vincenzo Vince Rizzo, a known mob boss who had interests in the casino and illegal gambling business. Although Etienne couldn't confirm that Rizzo was directly involved in Karl Meyer's death, the connections between the two and the threat-laden atmosphere of the recordings made it clear that something much bigger was at stake. Rizzo, known for his coolness and for handling situations in his own way, had infiltrated Karl Meyer's casino without anyone suspecting his presence until it was too late. The shock of his name reverberated through the interrogation room, and Harrington knew the investigation was just beginning. Detective Harrington arrested Vince Rizzo firmly, but the mobster was surprisingly calm about the situation. He did not seem upset by the accusations being made against him. When the detective began to question him, Vince admitted without hesitation that he did have a relationship with Karl Meyer. The two were friends and shared a common hobby, poker. However, Vince insisted that the games had no illegal bets, and that if there was ever any money involved, Karl always paid it without anyone complaining. According to him, that was the basis of their friendship. A solid relationship where debts were never a problem because Karl always paid them off. Vince's tone changed slightly when the detective asked him about the recent problems. It was then that the mobster revealed that things started to get complicated when Karl decided to invite his son-in-law Daniel to poker games. Daniel, according to Vince, was not a regular player. Rather, he was a compulsive gambler. In just a few games, the young man had run up significant debt. Karl, with his need to keep his image intact, covered Daniel's debts, not letting the matter transcend outside the gaming tables. But what had really put Vince in an awkward position was Karl's behavior. As a businessman and casino owner, Karl had a reputation to protect, and his son-in-law's debts were only jeopardizing it. That's where Vince, with his ruthlessness, began to intervene in a more direct way. According to him, he began to intimidate Daniel, pressuring him to pay in some way. While intimidation was not what Carl had envisioned, it was what Vince felt was necessary to maintain control of the situation. The detective tried to delve deeper into what Vince meant by that last sentence. Daniel had found another way to pay, but the mobster refused to elaborate. His expression hardened and he closed himself off to any further questions. Although he had admitted his involvement in the intimidation, Vince made it clear that he was not willing to reveal more about what had happened between him and Daniel, nor about the ways in which the young man had tried to pay off his debts. Harrington, however, couldn't help but sense that something else was behind Vince's evasive attitude. There was something about the relationship that didn't quite fit, something that went beyond poker debts and intimidation. Without a clear answer as to Daniel's mode of payment, the detective knew there were still loose pieces to this puzzle that, for some reason, Vince was unwilling or unable to reveal. Detective Harrington soon turned his attention to Daniel Foster, the son-in-law of the victim, Carl Meyer. The relationship between Daniel and his wife, Jessica, was far from perfect. Although at first everything seemed normal, the tension in their marriage increased with each passing day. Daniel, a man in his 30s, had fallen into a deep hole of gambling debts, which led him to involve his father-in-law, Carl, who eventually had to cover the huge sums of money Daniel owed. Most disturbing of all, however, was the fact that Carl was not the only one paying Daniel's debts. During the interrogation, Detective Harrington discovered that Daniel, in desperation, had resorted to even darker methods to pay off his commitments. The method of payment Daniel used to cover his debts to the most dangerous gamblers was something no one would have imagined: his wife, Jessica. Daniel revealed that, although Carl paid the debts directly in most cases, there were times when the debt collector's threats were so intense that there was no other option but to resort to a more personal arrangement. Vince, a disreputable man with strong ties to the gambling world, had begun pressuring Daniel to find a solution to the outstanding payments. In a dark twist, Daniel agreed to let his wife, Jessica, be the one to pay in a way he would never have considered before. Vince would sleep with her as a way to settle the debts. Detective Harrington, upon hearing the confession, began to glimpse a pattern of manipulation and desperation that was finally beginning to surround Carl Meyer's tragic fate. With Daniel's confession, the reasons for the family tensions and threats began to fall into place, and the detective realized that the complexities of the case involved not only money, but a series of shady deals leading to a spiral of corruption and crime that now seemed to have a point of no return. Jessica couldn't take the pressure anymore when she found herself in front of Detective Harrington. At first, she tried to deny it, but the truth came out with a mixture of shame and fear. Jessica confessed that her relationship with Vince was not a loving one, but a desperate arrangement. She had begun sleeping with him in order to pay off the enormous debts of her husband, Daniel. The Meyer family, in their eagerness to maintain their status and protect their name, had fallen into a spiral of easy money, gambling, and lies. Daniel, her husband, had accumulated a debt with dangerous people, including mobsters and illegal gamblers, and she saw no other way out. When Carl, her father, learned of the situation, he brutally confronted her. Through security tapes he had installed himself, Carl discovered what had been going on in secret. Carl's fury soon exploded. It was then that he entered Vince's room, seeking to put an end to what he considered a betrayal of his family. The confrontation between the two was violent, and Carl, unable to contain his anger, accused Vince of manipulating his daughter. It was at this point that Vince, with an unnerving calmness, slid the blame onto Daniel. He said that all of this had started with his son-in-law's decisions, which had led the family into an abyss from which they could no longer climb out. As the argument escalated, Carl stormed off to find his son-in-law. At the time, what happened next was never clear, but Jessica never saw her father again. Carl was never heard from again since that confrontation, and the silence that followed marked the beginning of Detective Harrington's desperate search. The key piece of this confession was the feeling of desperation Jessica shared. What she had done with Vince was not out of love. but out of a need to save her family. But at the same time, guilt and fear over the external threats that loomed over them drove Jessica to do the unthinkable. She had given in to the pressure, unaware of how deeply she was involved in something much darker. It didn't take Detective Harrington long to connect the dots. Detective Harrington remained silent as he watched Daniel in the interrogation room. The tension of the moment was palpable, and the young man finally seemed on the verge of an emotional breakdown. Everything that had been hidden was beginning to come to light. After the violent interruption of the conversation between Vince and Jessica, the case had taken an unexpected turn. Daniel, when confronted with the evidence and the growing suspicion about his relationship with his father-in-law, finally relented. In a trembling voice, he began to recount what happened that fateful night. Daniel explained that prior to the murder, his father-in-law, Carl, had decided to go to confront him. Carl was furious about gambling debts and, above all, strained family relations. What began as a discussion about the family's financial situation and Daniel's bad behavior quickly turned into a humiliation. Carl, in his overbearing manner, told him that he was a little man, that he had no character, and reproached him for the way he had handled things with his wife and the debts. At that moment, Daniel, already overwhelmed by stress and the pressure of family problems, could not control his anger. The humiliation was the trigger. In a fit of rage, Daniel hit Carl with a blunt object. He hit him with such fury that he could not stop until his father-in-law fell to the ground, dead. Fear came over him immediately. The thought of what he had just done paralyzed him, but he knew he had to do something. To cover up his crime and divert any possible suspicion in other directions, he decided to hide the body. He stuffed it in the freezer in the basement, hoping that no one would suspect anything. But what really sunk him even deeper was the cut on Carl's hand. Daniel thought that image could be mistaken for something mob-related, like revenge for his father-in-law's gambling debts. However, that manipulation was not enough. As the investigation progressed, Detective Harrington discovered that Daniel's lies were not enough to hide the truth. The weight of what he had done grew heavier as the pieces of the puzzle fit together. Days after Daniel's confession, Carl Meyer's case went to court, where the truth about the broken family relationship and tragedy was revealed to the jury. Despite the excuses and fear Daniel tried to convey during his cross-examination, the evidence was clear and compelling. The account of the confrontation with Carl, the humiliation he suffered, and the subsequent outburst of rage were determining factors in the trial. The attempt to conceal the crime, the dismemberment of the body, and the attempt to mask the murder as a mob score settling could not be ignored. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, in handing down the sentence, expressed that Daniel's actions were a mixture of desperation, lack of self-control, and fear, but made it clear that the extreme violence and manipulation of the crime scene could not be justified by family circumstances. The courtroom remained in deep silence as the judge, in a firm tone, declared that Daniel will serve a 25-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The audience listened to the dry sound of the gavel hitting the table as the condemned man was escorted out of the courtroom. A case that had begun with the Meyer family on the cusp of society and ended with an irreparable tragedy.